Here we go. Sorry for the 10 minutes delay, but we have technical problems that do continue. Italiano. Ciao Alberto, anzitutto, and welcome Clyde. Nice meeting you.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be English. One little piece of information in Italian. Per qualche ragione l'output audio di Clyde non funziona, quindi stiamo usando il telefono, cioè il suo microfono funziona, come avete sentito la sua voce arriva, quella di Alberto, del sottoscritto pure, sia output che input, però perché perché Clyde possa sentire quello che diciamo, siamo anche collegati col telefono, quindi qualche volta sentirete un ritorno quando non siamo rapidi a chiudere i microfoni per evitare il ritorno. Said that, I'll switch to English and I give the words to Alberto, I guess, who's the person that knows Clyde better, and Clyde is our guest today, so thanks again for being with us.
Michele, but I don't think Clyde can hear me very well.
I'm not hearing Alberto.
Okay. Clyde, can you give a little bit of history of the relationship between US and China? And what do you think the US should adjust its strategy vis-a-vis China?
No, I'm very sorry, but I'm not hearing Alberto.
Yeah, no, don't worry.
Vai tu, Michele.
Yeah, he's asking you to give your view of the US-China relation from an historical perspective over the last, say, 20, 30 years.
Okay. Well, I would say that it has been a kind of a roller coaster between the U.S. and China. If you go all the way back to the mid-1970s, you remember President Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to Beijing, met with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and agreed on establishing formal relations between China and the United States. So effectively, the United States recognized Communist China as China and Taiwan as a part of China, but not under the Communist Party. And then I was in the Reagan administration in the 1980s, and the Chinese had begun to experiment with getting rich. Deng Xiaoping famously said to get rich is wonderful. And it was the view of many in the US, both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, that if we open trade with China and if we welcomed China into the global system, that China would liberalize and eventually democratize and become what Bob Zoellick used to call a responsible stakeholder in the global system. And so I led the first U.S. trade mission to China in 1982. And from that point, we began to see substantial U.S. investment. The U.S. government was encouraging American companies to invest in China and do business in China. And as the 1980s proceeded into the 1990s, the investment and trade began to rise substantially. But you may remember that in 1989, there was the so-called Tiananmen Square incident in which students were demonstrating in China and Beijing for freedom and for democracy. And eventually, Deng Xiaoping unleashed the army and shot the students. That caused, of course, globally a big eruption. George H.W. Bush was president at the time, and he made a critical decision, which I think historians will labor over for a long time. Bush had been president, had been a U.S. ambassador to China, and he had established a warm affection for China. And so in the wake of the shootings at Tiananmen Square, Bush sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, immediately to Beijing. And the message was, don't worry, George Bush will keep the boats from rocking. George Bush is your best friend right now. That was the message to Deng Xiaoping. And on that message was rebuilt or began to recover the U.S.-China relationship. In 1992, of course, Bill Clinton ran for president. Clinton's platform, his slogan during the campaign, went as follows: no dictators from Baghdad to Beijing. So that was a very tough line. Clinton was saying, we don't want any dictators in Beijing. That appeared to be contrary to the let's be friendly approach of George H.W. Bush. But as soon as Clinton became president, he adopted a new line. And the new line was positive engagement. The idea was that we would negotiate with China to create more trade, reduce trade barriers, reduce tariffs, and try to gradually engage in integration of the two economies. There was a major obstacle at the time, which was that the World Trade Organization had been established in the early 1990s, but China was not included. So there began a movement to bring China into the World Trade Organization. That was supported by George H.W. Bush, and it was also supported by Bill Clinton. And negotiations lasted until the year 2000, when George W. Bush became president. But China entered the World Trade Organization in the year 2000 and welcomed by George W. Bush. Now, it's very important to understand the reasoning on the American side for this policy. It's very simple. Many American international leaders, foreign policy makers, high-level officials, as well as the American economics community, were captured by the idea that free trade would automatically bring free politics. In other words, through free trade, through opening the global markets to China and achieving reciprocal trade with China, that China would automatically, inevitably become a more democratic kind of regime and eventually become a democracy like those of the US and of Western Europe. That was kind of a faith. And even when George W. Bush was president, the policy of the Republican Party at the time was well stated by Bob Zellick, who was the U.S. trade rep at the time. And it's what I said. The slogan was, we want China to be a responsible stakeholder in the rules-based liberal global order. And under that slogan, that rubric of policy, the U.S. government promoted increasing trade, increasing investment by U.S. and other Western corporations into China. And a good example of it is, let's take Apple. It's interesting to understand that virtually everything that Apple sells today originated as part of a technology development program established by the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. This is the part of the U.S. military establishment that focuses on development of leading-edge, cutting-edge technology. Everything that Apple makes originated in that program. Everything that Apple sells today is made in China. And that occurred because in 1998, Tim Cook was hired by Apple to become the successor. And Tim eventually became the CEO. He had worked in China previously, and he looked at Apple's operations in the U.S., where production was then taking place, and he said, "My God, we can do this in China for much, much less. The workers in China are much less well paid, no health benefits to pay, much cheaper in China." So he moved all of Apple's production to China. And today, as I said, everything that Apple makes is made in China, which raises, I think, a fundamental and interesting question. Is Apple a Chinese company, an American company, or is it a Chinese company? And I would argue that the answer is it's more of a Chinese company than it is of an American company. Why do I say that? I say that because in the US political system, a company like Apple, a CEO like Tim Cook, is immensely powerful. They make huge donations. I mean, right now, Apple and other major corporations are making donations to Joe Biden, to Trump for the political race for president. They're making donations to candidates running for the Senate and for the House of Representatives. Tim Cook, Apple spends billions of dollars on lobbying in Washington. He has instant entree. He can call the president or any other major official anytime that he chooses. Instant entree to power. Does he have that kind of entree in Beijing? Absolutely not. And so from where I sit, I think Apple is more of a Chinese company than an American company. And I think that many American companies, and I think European companies as well, are beginning to understand that you can invest in China, you can do business in China, but you do it under the rules of the Chinese Communist Party. And you do it with a country that is essentially dedicated to catching up with and passing and surpassing the economies and the politics and the doctrines of the Western or of the global democracies. So that's how I see the evolution of U.S.-China relations.
I leave it to you, Michele. Go on.
All right. Thanks, Clyde. Well, don't leave it all to me, Alberto. Maybe, yeah, unfortunately, we have this problem with audio. So maybe if Claudius took, maybe we can get, yeah, let me do this, Alberto. Let me set up, well, I'll ask a question to Clyde, and then I'll set up a conference call for the three of us, so Clyde can hear also you.
Okay.
Right. So let me actually say two things. One, I will be the pro-Chinese in this trio, Clyde. I warn you.
Okay.
Let me play the role. I do share some of your views. I don't share others. Let me try to get on those I don't share. Otherwise, repeating what I agree with you is not interesting. Our listeners are familiar with this rule. We don't discuss what we agree upon. We move over and discuss what we don't. So the first is this, the fact that a company that might be somewhat on the frontier of a technology, but certainly has not much relevance for national defense or national security, or only a very partial relevance, such as Apple, you need to think if it is American or Chinese or Australian. Well, it's whatever its shareholders want it to be, and its shareholders are distributed wherever they are in the world. It's incorporated in the United States. If it complies with United States corporation laws and regulation, it's fine. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If the U.S. doesn't like the way Apple and other companies behave by abiding to the current regulation, all they have to do is to change regulation, such as forbidding, for example, to have more than a certain percentage of the value added manufactured or total revenues manufactured outside the continental US or the 50 states or whatever. So I find that kind of approach a bit hard to digest, because it seems to fly in the face of a certain view that we have of world trade, free markets, and essentially what companies are supposed to do, which are supposed to maximize shareholder value, go around the world and invest whatever they can within legal limits in order to do the best. The other is the view that we should be so afraid. So this is more a detail, but I think it's a difference in points of view. The other is a more general point of view, which I understand where it comes from, and sometimes I share, but sometimes I truly doubt, which is to assume that any regime that has a political and a constitutional setting other than ours is necessarily an enemy to the extent that it's competing with us in trying to catch up technologically and economically, because that has a military implication. That's to assume that in some sense, U.S. authority in the world, U.S. presence in the world is purely determined by the weapons and the military superiority, and not by other form of leadership, economic, cultural, political, and more generally in terms of the example of the way you run a good country. That seems to be affecting the general view of China, not so much for their internal politics, but for the fact that necessarily we have to see them as enemies as opposed to adversaries, whereas their behavior overall is substantially different from the one of Russia over the last century, I would say. And so I have a hard time following you along that line. Can you elaborate on what leads you to take that kind of position?
Yeah, let me make 2 points. One is, when you talk about the job of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value, I would contest that a little bit. Corporations anywhere in the world are chartered by governments, and what the government is doing when it charters a corporation is it's giving it limited liability. Limited liability enables the corporation to take risks and make investments that it might not make if it didn't have limited liability. And the reason that governments give limited liability is because they think that the government, that the corporations will do something good for the citizens. They might do something good for the shareholders as well, but the point of the incorporation license is to do something good for the citizens of the granting government. So that suggests that a corporation, if it's chartered by the government of Italy, needs to think a little bit about what it's doing for Italy. Or if it's chartered by the US government, what it's doing for the people of the United States. So it's not, in my view, it's not just a matter of shareholder value. Secondly, if we look at the main question you ask about, is China, is it right for us to be contesting with China on a broad front? Look, in 2009 or 2010 about, the Chinese Communist Party published document Q, document number 9. Document number 9 says we don't believe in human rights. We don't believe in freedom of the press. We don't believe in free politics. So the Chinese Communist Party has declared and made it very clear that they are fundamentally opposed to the values and to the fundamental human rights and rule of law that we have adopted over a long period of time in the free world. So, China is not a free country. It's not part of the free world. A lot of the presidents and high-ranking officials of the U.S. government for a long time thought that through trade they could democratize China. And I think it has become increasingly clear. Certainly Xi Jinping does not make any bones about where he wants China to go. And clearly he does not want China to become a democracy, to have human rights, to have a rule of law. to have freedom of the press. He doesn't want that. You pose the question: is this always? Is this have to be a matter of war? Does it have to be a matter of armed forces or quasi war? That's a complex, difficult question. We hope that there's not a war. We try to pursue diplomacy so as not to have a war. But I think we have to be at some point. The free world has certain fundamental pillars that it can't abandon. And I think that one of the things that is becoming increasingly evident is that as China advances in its technological capability and in its, let's say, military technological capability, it's clear, more and more clear, that what we have considered to be free trade, including freedom of international investment, it raises some fundamental problems. The U.S. National Security Advisor, National Security Administration, does not want China to be a leader in semiconductor technology. That's the National Security Council of the United States is essentially saying, look, it's very important for the defense of democracy, for the defense of freedom, that we maintain, and America maintains, or that the free world maintains leadership in semiconductor technology. Well, if you want to maintain leadership in semiconductor technology, and if that's important for maintaining freedom and rule of law, then you can't at the same time smile upon your corporations who are pouring money into the Chinese technology development. The two just don't go together. Now, Janet Yellen just came back from Beijing last week, and Janet is trying to straddle the two sides. She's, on the one hand, saying, well, we have to de-risk, which suggests that we can't engage in open free trade as we do with the EU or Mexico or other major players, Japan, other major players. But she's saying we don't want to decouple. Now, I personally don't think that Janet can maintain that straddle. But she's not ready yet to give up the notion that somehow through globalization and free trade, we can democratize and bring China more into the free world camp. And I think that's unlikely. And so therefore, I think we're inevitably, the free world is of necessity of its own, the defense of its own values and its own way of governance, will have to maintain some policy distance between China and itself.
Alberto, you want to go ahead? Yeah, I would have a follow-up later, but I think it's time for Alberto to step in.
Clyde, can you hear me?
I hear you. Yep.
I hear you. Yep. Now, I heard you missed the point.
Sorry?
You're okay. Go.
No, I can hear.
No, I can hear. Go now.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that the idea of bringing China into the WTO was pushed very hard in the U.S. was pushed very hard by the business community. The business community pushed hard because it's thought that it saw big profits potential in China, and indeed it did. There was another element, which is this element of trade having an arching effect of planting the seeds of freedom of speech and of democracy. Now, all of our countries have China experts. So, we have in the U.S. scholars who have studied, they learned the language, Chinese, Mandarin, who have spent some time living in China, studied Chinese history, studied Chinese political science. And many of them took the position that if we opened up our economies to China, brought China into the World Trade Organization, that this would lead the Chinese to move more in our direction of recognizing and protecting human rights and developing democratic forms of administration and government. Now, here I am an American, I'm talking to two Italians, and you guys are fluent in English. You've both lived, I know Alberto's lived in the US. But there raises an issue that I think is important in China. And that is that while we in the US have scholars who are fluent in Mandarin, I'm not sure that our scholars understand how Chinese think. They know how to speak the language, but do they really understand how Chinese, particularly the Chinese Communist Party, particularly people like Xi Jinping, do they really understand how Xi Jinping thinks? And I think not. And I think that the notion that somehow if we hugged and kissed China and brought it into the World Trade Organization, that it would reciprocate and become increasingly democratic. This was a false god. It was a false notion. Remember that. Go back to the late 1980s when the Chinese were trying to decide whether to open their economy. And there was resistance within the Chinese Communist Party leadership. Many of the top leaders were afraid that too many flies would get into the Chinese atmosphere. And Deng took the position that, yes, there would be some flies coming in, but that the party could handle that. Now, think about two positions that Deng Xiaoping took. One was, he said, hide your light to the main leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. Deng Xiaoping said, hide your light. Why hide your light? What do you have to hide? Well, I believe that Deng didn't want the West to really understand where he wanted to go. It was convenient for China at that moment to have access to the West, to have Western investment and technology flowing into China. And he didn't want to give any impression to the West that he was really at heart, a hardcore communist. But he was at heart a hardcore communist. And that's why he said, hide your light. Now, think again, in 1997, prior to 1997, 1996, 1995, we had the beginnings of the internet and the opening of the World Wide Web. And China was part of that. In 1996, if you were in Beijing, you could get on your computer and you could go to whatever search engine you were using, and you could look up, for example, Tiananmen Square. You could get the information. In 1997, China built the Great Firewall, which separated China from the global World Wide Web. So China wasn't looking to integrate with the rest of the world. It was looking to maintain Chinese communist dominance in China. And so built the World Wide Web. Now, interestingly, at that time, Bill Clinton was president. What was Clinton's reaction to the World Wide Web? He laughed. He said, it'll never work. It'd be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Try to nail ice cream to the wall. Couldn't do it. Well, it turns out you can do it. China can do it. Not 100%, but 98.9% they can do it. So again, I come back to this point, Alberto, that America's China experts, America's international policy experts were kidding themselves. Bob Zillick, we want China to be a responsible stakeholder. China didn't want to be a responsible stakeholder in our system. China wanted to build its own system, which it has continued to try to do and is having, I think, quite a great deal of success. So the West, at least the West in America, I'm talking about not dummies. I'm talking about the graduates of our top universities, the intellectual elite of the United States. They didn't get it, in my view. And because they didn't get it, they continue to try to make things work. And in doing so, they, in my view, they have made our present situation much more difficult than it had to be.
Another point, at the time of China joining the WTO, China committed to lower its import duties. So the Americans said, that's really win-win, because we can now start exporting a lot of goods to China, and we will do great. What actually happened was the reverse. In spite of China lowering dramatically its import duties, the trade deficit of the U.S. went through the roof. Why is that?
It's because of a false understanding of China. So, the American elite, policy elite, the trade representatives, etc., they thought that the main barriers to trade in China were tariffs. But, we know that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't operate on the basis of rule of law. So, if Beijing instructs a Chinese corporation not to buy American, it's not going to buy. And the U.S. policy leaders, negotiators, were assuming in their heads that the Chinese economy worked more or less like the U.S. or the EU economy. And if you reduce the tariffs, well, then prices would go down and they would invest. But, there are many barriers to trade aside from tariffs. And those barriers can be created without any publicity. They can be exercised through administrative guidance. And secondly, the Chinese government was pouring subsidies into what it thought were key industries. Solar panels is a good example. If I go back to the year 2010, Germany was the low-cost manufacturer of solar panels. The Chinese, so according to the rules of global trade and the rules of the WTO, Germany should have been exporting solar panels to China. The Chinese decided that solar panels were going to be an important market of the future and that China should be number one. So China raised tariffs on solar panels and began to subsidize its manufacturers. Now, very important point. Manufacturing is characterized by economies of scale. So the more you make, the lower the unit cost. This is not true of farming or fishing or mining or lawyering or financing, but it is true of manufacturing. So if a government can create an environment in which its domestic producer is able to gain enormous scale, it can become the low-cost producer. And that is exactly what China has done in solar panels. The Germans are not in the business anymore. They played by the rules. The Chinese played by their rules, and they are the kings of solar panels. So again, the West was naive. the West was just naive. It didn't understand how the Chinese Communist Party thinks or works. It didn't give proper understanding. It didn't show proper understanding of of administrative guidance. As you well know, in any government, ideas can be subtly planted, comments can be made. That's true in all governments. In the free world, we try to control that by having a rule of law. So if comments are being made, you're getting administrative guidance that might be contrary to the rules. In the free world, you can challenge that and go to court, but not in China. You do not challenge administrative guidance in China. You salute and you go do what the guiders want you to do.
Yeah, I think I need to step. Alberto, aspetta un moment. If you want to ask a question, you have to unmute also your StreamYard thing, not just the phone.
Go ahead, Michele.
So, are you asking the question because I unmuted you?
Yeah, I wanted to add that with WTO, what the US underestimated was the huge amount of foreign direct investment that went into China from the US, because through WTO accession, China was granted permanent favored nation treatment.
Yeah.
So basically, the US corporations started offshoring their production and re-importing into the US. That killed the trade balance as well.
Oh, absolutely. Let's not forget an important point, which is that China, remember when China came into the World Trade Organization, it didn't enter the World Trade Organization as under the same conditions as the EU countries or the US. It entered as a developing country. So it was granted kind of special exemptions from some of the World Trade Organization rules. So China, you're correct that global corporations, both the US and in Europe, entered the Chinese market. But when a foreign corporation entered China, the Chinese said, look, General Motors or Ford or Apple or whoever you are, you can come in our market. We're glad to have you, but you have to produce a certain amount in China. And you have to transfer key technology. So, the system was set up in such a way that China was enabled to continue a discriminatory industrial policy and trade policy as part of its entrance into the WTO. And the global corporations were, they were so hungry for Chinese business that they agreed to transfer technology. They agreed to take on, they were commanded by China, you have to have a partner. And here's your partner. We'll tell you the company who's going to be your partner. And the foreign corporations accepted them. Now, again, come back to my original point. You might argue that was in the best interest of the shareholders. I think it's very hard to argue that that's in the best interest of the citizens of the free world.
Well,
actually, I don't think it was in the best interest of the shareholders either.
Let me try to step in and ruin this love story between Alberto and Clyde. I think you guys are seriously confused and unfortunately quite damaging, because you're mixing three dimensions that should not be mixed. Let me start from the part where I agree. But on the one, I think your story, especially Clyde narrative, is a bit naive. I don't really believe that U.S. experts, UX administration U.S. Treasury, Department of State, and CIA and whatnot, and other lobbyists were so naive and so silly in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s to believe this narrative that is now coming out that seems to be more out of a Walt Disney movie, in which, oh, we're all nice Westerners, we do free trade, give you all these beautiful technologies, and you guys behave and we're going to become Anglo-Saxons, democracies, just like us in about 20 years, after 3,000 years of following a completely different path of civilization. I don't believe that for a second. So I don't want to hear in 2024 to be told, oh, you know, we were nice, we opened the arms, they were supposed to become founding fathers and write something like the American Constitution and adopt, you know, Madison and Jefferson or whatever you want point of view. Well, they didn't. They remained Chinese, bad boys. No, that was not the story. I don't believe you believed it for a second, and I don't believe it makes any sense. The point, if there is a point, and it's far, far, far with good piece of Fukuyama and company from being proven in history, is that some form of economic development may change people culture, value sets, make people appreciate more individual freedom and liberty and freedom of speech. But it certainly does it, like monetary policy in Friedman's view, with long and variable lags. And those long and variable lags may easily last very many decades. Anybody that knows China and has lived in China for some months, in China proper, that is in the cities of China, knows the enormous difference in the attitude and behavior of people in daily life and in the value system between now and 1980. So a change was and is undergoing, which reflects, for example, in their demographic pattern, in their attitude toward military service, in their interest in readings, in the diffusion of certain type of culture and leisure activity, in their continuous interest in traveling and getting education abroad, in their tendency to come abroad, to come to the US and behave, or US or Europe, and try to integrate and adopt patterns of consumption and behavior that are very similar. So it's absolutely not true. It's just a false narrative that the 40 years of opening to China after, we better don't remember, well, don't forget, we better remember and don't forget, 3,000 years of being another world, like it or not. Like it or not, the Chinese have a long-run perspective that maybe Americans don't have, but Europeans do have, and Italians in particular. They have a long-run perspective. You may like that or not. You may find that silly. You may find that stupid. You may find that primitive. You might find it whatever you want. But it is the way it is. The same way that the Persian keeps believing they're Persian, and the Indians are proud of their being Indians, and the Afghans, so they're being Afghans. The Chinese are proud of being Chinese, exactly the same way the people from Calabria in Italy are proud to be from Magna Grecia, as they like to think. It doesn't matter if this is an illusion. It doesn't really matter if this takes them on pattern of development that are probably, from my point of view, strictly inferior to others. I live in the United States. I've chosen to live in the United States 41 years ago, and that reveals my preferences. But my preferences are of little relevance in understanding what the other people do. So if we want to understand China, I think we should take that into account and dismiss the narrative of the bad Communist Party, which was good up to Deng Xiaoping. What's going on in China is a big return to the imperial millennial story of China, dressed with the communist flag, but because we all know that they keep saying whenever they use some name, it's with Chinese characteristics, which is a classical Chinese way of understatement and saying exactly the opposite. We have the empire. The Communist Party is the Mandarin Act. The Communist Party works exactly like the Mandarin system that ruled China for 2,000 years. You enter the Communist Party by an exam, you have to apply. The Communist Party takes only the best. You have to pass the test, and you become part of the elite that runs the country. Yes, it's not a democracy, not at all. But I think it would be utterly naive. And I don't believe, repeat for a second, that intelligent people in Washington believed that in the 80s and 90s and 2000, that in 30 years, a millennial culture would have been turned around and everybody would have been like they were living in Austin or Silicon Valley or New York City, preferably outside Manhattan. Okay, so let's take away this part. Okay, and let's focus on the part where we agree, which is the economic part. So the Chinese did what every underdeveloped country did to catch up. They didn't do anything different from Italy. They didn't do anything different from Spain. They didn't do anything different from many other countries. In fact, they didn't do anything different from the United States in protecting the internal market in the 19th century. The United States protected its internal market in the 19th century when they had to catch up and overcome England, United Kingdom. Very, very serious. You know better than me. So again, they did it with Chinese characteristics. And I agree that in order to make that trade more convenient for us, we should have said, listen, buddy, you want to play by those rules, then we play by those rules too. And I'm very fine if we do that. And we should do it. And I certainly agree the Xi Jinping ideas of getting out of troubles with some kind of commercial war on the West is not only wrong, not only damaging, it's a bit idiotic, to tell the truth, which signs the extreme limit of the current leadership in China and their great difficulty. And I totally agree that we should react by saying, okay, you block import, we block import. You impose production quotas, sharing of technology on foreign direct investment, we'll do the same on yours. You want to buy a company in the United States? Well, that will happen with this restriction, with restriction on technology appropriation, and so on and so forth. That's absolutely fine. The naivete was in this Washington consensus view that a certain form of free trade was going to play magic. But, Clyde, let's be honest. The people that pushed more for that were the big American corporation that wanted to set up plants in China. Was the big American corporation that had seen what the Taiwanese counterparts had done in the 80s and 90s by setting up plants in the Guangdong and in Southeast China and say, me too. Wow. Millions of cheap, very productive workers, very obedient, ready to go to the factories. I want those factories too. I want those workers too. That was the reason we took that commercial policy. Let's not fool ourselves by saying there was the bad Chinese that tricked us into, and we were just like, naive Snow Whites going there with technology. Says, oh, guys, we give you free trade. You're all going to become libertarians. No, none of that, which is why Apple is there. Apple doesn't produce its stuff in China because they believe that that's going to make the Chinese, I don't know, smoke pot. Apple produces its stuff in China because it's profit making. I don't think we ourselves.
Okay, can I respond, Michel? May I respond?
Yeah, okay, if you want, because then the third part is about the military part, on which the question is more complicated. But let's go on these two. The first is that I would leave aside the ideological part and the communists, a different story. We better look at China for what it is. It's a country with 3,000 years of history. And the second, the economic part, you're absolutely right. But hey, we did it because our corporation wanted it. And now our corporation feels there is too much competition. So, okay, let's play tough. I'm more in favor of playing tough.
So, Michel, I'm sure you are aware of the book by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History.
Yeah, it's bullshit.
So that book, in my view, was complete nonsense. But the elite of the Western world took it seriously. And you made 3 points. One was that China is an ancient country and it does things its own way, and I completely agree with that. And you made the point that China had developed an industrial policy a la Japan and South Korea, and I agree with that. The point where you're wrong is that yes, U.S. corporations invested in China because they thought they could make a lot of money, and they did in China. But I was there, Michelle. I was in the administrations. I know the people in the administration. I argued endlessly with the top economists, Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, Janet Yellen. I know them very well. And I can tell you that they were naive and foolish, and they bought the silliness that China could be democratized through trade. Now, going forward, I completely agree. You're right. The U.S. got rich by being protectionist and mercantilist. So did every other country that ever got rich. And I'm very much in favor of going back to mercantilism and protectionism, which I think the U.S. Is being forced to do, and is being forced to do that because the undermining of economic and technological leadership that is occurring by dint of China's policies is having a national security effect on the U.S. and not just the U.S., but on the West generally. And so in response to that, as I said, we have Janet Yellen talking about de-risking, but even, I think de-risking is silly, but even that, it's a step away from free trade. It's a step away from what was being preached in the 1990s and between the 2000 and the last couple of years. So I think, because of the national security element, the free trade doctrine is being undermined, and I think eventually will be abandoned.
Yes, okay. That's. Can you hear me, Clyde? No. Clyde, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I see. If we agree that there is an issue there, and that what we are facing, some people want to call it imperialism. It's an empire, exactly like the U.S. has become. People have to, in order to. You said you were the. I mean, I find it a bit naive to have to say this thing. I completely agree that Fukuyama is total bullshit. I thought so when it came out the first time, and I've been thinking so for a long time. And if there is something that I thought is more insightful, is the Huntington view, because it has the ability to look at long-run issues in the world dynamics. The issue we need to face is it necessarily leading to a military confrontation because there might be only one empire on the face of Earth? Or could there be two, and could they live at a distance, at arm's distance, not trusting the other completely or too much, but just a little? But could they find a way of avoiding escalation that would lead to military confrontation? That's, I think, the big question we have to face with with China, by not forgetting India, and by not forgetting, maybe I'm taking a European point of view here, that today the real threat toward democracies is Russia, much more than China. Russia is an active and winning, because of our behavior, threat to democracies. And I believe the US strategists should ask themselves the question, am I really going to be able, with the weak support that I get from Europe and the weakness the European political camp and military camp and public opinion and economic system display, to handle the future 50 years in a world in which China is an enemy, Russia is a winning enemy, Islam has become, and I'm turning it, into a complete enemy, and I have certainly no friends in Latin America and in Africa? Is that really the game that strategically we're getting in? Because it seems to me that this is really the game we're getting in. And I don't like it. I don't think we're going to come up on top. It's a bit too much. And it may imply that there is only one way to go, which is to take advantage of the temporary military superiority and strike. But striking now may imply some form of Armageddon, at least local, which may not like. And when I think of China, it seems to me that among these four fronts we have in front, Russia, China, the Islamic world, the two unknown, or so to speak, triangular continents, Latin America and Africa, and the third subcontinent, also triangular, India, the one in which the population is actually more akin in behavior. But there's one thing that anybody that has lived in China knows. If there is a lifestyle the Chinese adore, is the one I have around here, the Midwest America. They want to live like my suburban friends. Among those cultures, the Chinese, paradoxically, is the least remote from ours. And so it's a strategic choice what we want to do with those guys. Russia would have crumbled in the last 2 years had not been for the support the Chinese giving to it. And as tensions between us, US, and China grew, China kept boosting and increasing its support for Russia, which is the natural reaction. What do you expect that to do? What do you expect them to do? Why shouldn't they be supporting Russia aggression, given that we have decided to shut down our relationship with them? I mean, sometimes I wonder if in taking strategic decision, we don't somehow feel that we're so special and so powerful that we can handle the whole world all alone. Let me just say that, and that goes beyond the part we agree. The part we agree is the economic sanction, the economic behavior, and all that. I totally agree. So I don't want to insist on that. It's the big picture that I tend to disagree.
Yeah, well, I think there's something in what you say, but China didn't have to support Russia, and the Chinese move to support Russia has only exacerbated the concern in the U.S. and speeded up the U.S. move towards delinking with China, you're right. I mean, we live in an interesting world. India is increasingly a major player. But India seems to be leaning in the direction of the U.S. The U.S. has been extending its relationships with Japan and South Korea, Philippines, and Australia to include India. Nobody forced the Indians to come our way. They came voluntarily. So I don't know. I think I tend to look at China as a kind of a unique player in the sense that, as you said, China has a long history. It has a long history of being unique. It also, I think we shouldn't overlook this. It is a Marxist-Leninist political engine, with emphasis on Leninist. And Leninist parties will never be unsuspicious. Leninism is always looking for, how am I going to be overthrown? Leninism must be dominant. And I see two things in China. I see Xi Jinping talking about the rejuvenation of China. And so I interpret that as she wants to recover the China of the Qing Empire, or even of earlier empires, and That, however, drives him and the party and China in the direction of isolationism to a great extent, hence the control of the press, control of entry and exit. I see India as, a country with enormous potential for the future, but of course it has its own internal problems. But I don't see India joining up with China or Russia. They keep talking about the alphabetical the BRICS. They keep talking about BRICS. I don't see. India is a BRIC, but I don't see the BRICS with India becoming a threat to the political, let's say, political world.
Yeah, I guess on this we will have to agree to disagree. History will have to tell. I think that there is a huge miscalculation in this. I will unmute. No, there is somebody that needs to be muted. It's Alberto. Okay. Don't worry, I did it. Let's agree to disagree. We will have to see in 10 years where we are. I think in particular, US is getting illusional with India, the same way they probably got illusional with China in the 80s and 90s. India, it's an old culture. Hinduism is a very nationalistic religion, a very nationalistic set of beliefs. There is a huge Indian pride. India has always played the game correctly from their point of view of what in Italy we call the two oven policies since the days of the Cold War. I don't think that has changed. This party and this government may be as remote, if you want, and less Westerner than the Congress Party of Gandhi and Nehru was, but they keep following their same policies, which is good relations, also military with Russia, and good relations and trading and wars with U.S. and the Western world. But we play our own game. Industrial policy is not, they don't call it socialist, but it's not very different. So I think I think Washington is getting illusional with India in thinking that they have found in India a long-term partner and ally that will substitute China. It's not the case. It's not the case. It's probably temporarily the case because there is some perceived common enemy, which is the Muslim world because of Pakistan. But that may come and go. So we will see. We will see. I'll give the word to Alberto. At least we clarify where we disagree. On the economic side, I would, if I may ask, is what do you think? But I let Alberto elaborate on that. What do you think the next moves should be or could be?
Clyde, your word. Up to you. Clyde, you.
I'm sorry.
Clyde, you have this interesting idea about the free world consortium alliance.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that the U.S. Government, U.S. intellectual community, and significant part of U.S. industry, I think has come to a realization that China is not going to be as enriching in the future as it has been in the past. I think that Europeans, particularly Germans, are now beginning to realize that China was happy to have them when the Germans were transferring technology to China. But now that the Chinese have the technology, they're not so interested in having the Germans. And I think that, if I look at the other Asian countries, Indonesia, India, the major ones, all of them are seeming to be more open to the idea of a free trade, let's say a democratic free trade arrangement, which would not include China. And so, I was involved a number of years ago in initial negotiations for an EU-US free trade arrangement. That didn't work out, but it may be time to reconsider. I think that, more and more people around the world, but also very importantly, more and more of the intellectual elite of the US and of Europe, I think, have rethought their initial thinking about China and about the limits of economic integration with China. So I think it's worth pursuing what I would call a free world, free trade arrangement.
So let me ask, do you hear me? Do you hear me, Clyde? No. Wait, I have to open. Do you hear me now, Clyde?
I hear you.
Right. Let me do things. Sorry for the listeners, but we have this problem with. Okay, I think now it should work. Let me try to pursue further this thing. So what are you imagining? Are you imagining a world where essentially there are two free trade areas, or better, there is some kind of free trade area which is centered around US, and there is another trade area, free or not, that's a matter of point of view, centered around China? Is that what you envisage? And does that mean essentially suggesting the Trump administration forthcoming, or the Biden, let's see which way we'll go, to denounce the WTO treaty and say we're out of WTO, it doesn't make any sense anymore, that those times are gone, and bye-bye WTO. We'll build another set of we'll restart with some general agreement on tariffs and trade among countries that want to, and everything that we set up during the last 40 years, basically 40, 45 years, is in the trash bin. Is that, I'm shrinking time and making everything happening in one statement, but is that the perspective that you would recommend, or you think people should be moving? Hold on a second that I open your microphone.
Who's speaking here?
You.
Okay. So I think de facto, the World Trade Organization is, if not dead, very close to death right now. And I think that as long as China is a major factor in the World Trade Organization, it will not be an effective free trade organization. I think that if we took the EU and US, Mexico, Canada, and joined those two free trade areas together, and if we added in India, Indonesia, Brazil, other major democratic economies, we could have a much more effective free trade arrangement. I think it's important to understand that China is not that much of a trader. I was just in Southeast Asia for a while. I just got back a week ago. And it's funny, a lot of the leaders I was meeting with kept telling me that China is their biggest trade partner. And I had analyzed their trade, and I said, no, not actually. China doesn't trade with you. It exports to you. It doesn't buy from you. It exports to you. So it's not a trade partner. It might be a selling player, but it's not a trade partner. China doesn't stimulate imports. It imports what it can't make. It tries to copy that. As soon as it has copied that, it stops importing. So I think that actually we could, right now the World Trade Organization is pretty useless. I think it could become more useful if it were a trade organization based on democracies rather than on an attempt to integrate democracies and dictatorships.
No, I think you've been very clear.
I just
wait. I give the word to Alberto. No, there is something open. Let me. Oh yeah, it's Clyde. All right. You do it or I do it. Okay. Yeah, I think Clyde made it very clear what his view. I mean, I tend not to agree, but I think it's not important. As I said, we can agree to disagree, but that's the perspective. So the perspective that you're suggesting is let's define what are the democracies. I doubt Brazil will be very willing to join in, but Indonesia, well, it's complicated. And redefine world trade according to there is a big I would actually want to hear also what Alberto thinks. There is a big absentee in that picture. It's called Africa. I wonder what you guys what the view is. Africa is big, and it's 2 billion people almost. It's going to be 4 billion anytime, well, so to speak, soon, but soon enough that I might even be alive and see it just before saying goodbye. So, Alberto, I asked and debated enough. I'll shut up now.
Yes. Clyde, can you hear me? Clyde, can you hear me?
Can't hear you, yes.
No, I think Clyde has a point. It's obvious from this discussion, and I'm siding with Clyde. So, which I view Clyde as my mentor too. So this is natural that I side with Clyde. There is another element. China is having, and the element is China will screw up, most likely will screw up his relationship with the global South, because China has a very mercantilistic attitude, and which is more and more mercantilistic because it's tremendous oversupply of industrial goods. So in many ways, China is exporting a lot of industrial goods, manufactured goods to the global South, and this is impeding the industrial development of many countries like Brazil, like Africa, like South America. And at some point, all these places will find untenable. For example, Brazil, 3 weeks ago, started an investigation of dumping by a Chinese company into Brazil. Chile is doing the same thing. So if we develop a free trade area among, let's say, the free world, China will be forced to dump more and more goods into the global South and make that relationship untenable, because all these countries will never develop. Most of the countries in the global South, except the oil exporting countries, will never be able to have a viable economy if they don't switch from primary to secondary, if they don't get out of mining and get into manufacturing. But it will be impossible to them as long as China keep exporting very cheap goods into them. So their relationship is very fragile. If we manage to develop a free trade area among democracies, eventually others will follow, because China will not be able to sustain a free trade areas with those countries on its own, once it's basically blocked from exporting into developed countries like Europe and US. And Clyde is not counting on Japan and Korea. For example, for Korea now, the US is a much bigger export market than China was. It was unthinkable years ago. Now the US is a much bigger market for Korea, for Taiwan as well, and is getting there for Japan. So I think the relationship that China has with the developing countries is very fragile, and he cannot stand on his feet. So I can see maybe Clyde idea would not fly for many reasons, okay? Main reasons, democratic world is very stupid, as we can see from his action in the Ukraine war. So, you know, we are managed by stupid leaders, unfortunately. But if we have a discussion about ideas and principles and goals, I tend to side with Clyde. And my next article is going to be how China will end up screwing its relationship with the developing countries as well. This is going to exit in about a couple of weeks.
Clyde, you want to? Apologies for those listening, but we need to readjust microphones every round, so it takes a few seconds. Clyde, you wanna go on with that? Yeah, I think, well, I'm here in the middle with two oaks that wants to redo the world trade. I think you're wrong. I think you guys were wrong. If the Clyde narrative is correct in the 80s and 90s, in thinking delusionally about change of civilization. Let me ask one thing, just as a test. Clyde, what's your view of what's going on in Ukraine? What do you think the most likely outcome is, given the current choices of the U.S., not only administration, also the GOP and the overall Western attitude? Quite clearly, Russians have seen the writing on the wall and are pushing through. They're trying to get to a breakthrough in the next few months. And the breakthrough may be a substantial breakthrough this time, given U.S. attitude, given the fact that we have I mean, the display the other day, yesterday night, in fact, of aerial and defense power over Israel is the proof that if we had wanted, we could have protected the skies of Ukraine since 2 years ago, avoiding much disruption, much death, much massacre, and probably blocking the Russian invasion without even entering the Russian airspace. That's most interesting. We could have just simply done what was done in Israel, that is, prevent drones attack systematically by providing effective military support to Ukraine, which we've chosen not to. So that speaks volumes as to what the current attitude is and where the priorities are, which in my opinion are completely ideological. And when ideology calls the shots, things don't end up well. But I would like to understand what your view is. Have we de facto decided that Kiev will become a province of Moscow?
So who's talking? I'm not hearing anything.
You're talking. Clyde, you're talking. Hello, can you hear me, Clyde?
I hear you now. Yes.
You're talking. The question was, I asked the question to you. What's your view on
Right.
you know?
Yeah. No, listen, I really don't have a view on the Ukraine-Russia thing. I guess what I would say is that right now we have a division in the U.S. House of Representatives, which is effectively blocking further U.S. aid to Ukraine. I think that Biden will be able eventually to get the money, but I'm not sure. I think that I think the Ukrainian and the Israeli defense situations are quite different. Israel is a small country, and we have helped Israel build a powerful, effective anti-missile defense system. We never engaged in that kind of defense building in Ukraine, and I just don't have. I'm not that knowledgeable about Ukraine.
Alberto?
On the Ukraine issue, I agree with you. I mean, I see there's a complete disaster in terms of the democratic world ability to stand on its feet. I think it's both the US and Europe are a shame. We should be morally ashamed of what we are doing. I mean, we are not delivering arms to Ukraine. We are not delivering system to Ukraine. And the president of Germany, Scholz, is on a trip visit to China with a delegation of 200 business people. He did that 1 or 2 years ago. This is the second delegation since the COVID epidemic ended. This is a disaster. This the same guy who should put the money and help deliver some defense to Ukraine are now courting China back for business. I think I'm really ashamed to be European, and I'm pessimistic. I still hope on there's something positive might happen, but I don't know where. I really don't know where to look for sign of positive thinking. But in the regard of Ukraine, I couldn't agree more with Michele. And the US has been spending money in Israel for 80 years. I mean, the US has been giving Israel billions of dollars every year for the last 80 years. There is the Israel lobby in the US controls 80% of Congress. I mean, so it is really, this is another factor of shame. Like Israel is doing if you look at Gaza, is shameful. Gaza is like Dresden, looks like Dresden. And now Israel is doing this to a city of 3 million people. At the same time, we can do that we can protect Ukraine. This is why I like Clyde thinking. I think it's very difficult to get there because the democratic world is very dysfunctional. But I do like Clyde's idea. But Ukraine is teaching me a very sad lesson.
All right. I think we should give Clyde. Wait, hold on a second. I need to open this microphone so Clyde can hear me. I think we should give Clyde the last word. I think it's been extremely interesting. I mean, I don't think many discussions are so explicit and clear on different views, but we're grown up and we knew we would have disagreed, and so we agree to disagree. It's fine. I respect your analysis. I see where it comes from. As I said, on the economic side, I think we should take action. On the other, I have a different view. Alberto share your view, and so that's fine. But the thing Alberto said about Ukraine and Israel, I agree as well. Clyde, I mean, you're a man with a long history, with a lot of experience, knows Washington, and the way the U.S. elite makes up its mind and take decision infinitely better than I, and probably, if Alberto doesn't feel insulted of Alberto as well, at least on that side. And so give us your outlook on this issue we debated today, and more generally, if you want to take a position, that you don't have to side for either of the two parties, just your forecast about the next 6 months in American politics. And then I guess we can kiss each other goodbye until the next time.
I have to say I'm very disturbed at the moment. The political situation in the U.S. is not good. Put aside the fact that we have a presidential race coming up between Trump and Biden, but the House of Representatives is dysfunctional at the moment, and I think the election is going to be very unclear for the next 9 or 10 months. And the choices are difficult. So I have to say I'm pessimistic for the. I hope things turn out better than I fear they will. But I think that this is going to be a very difficult 7-8 months coming up in the United States. And the political situation here, the presidential race, is inevitably going to have an impact on international policy. So, if you think of Biden right now, Alberto, you made the excellent point that U.S. has been arming Israel for 80 years. And in the current situation, we have a president who, on the one hand, I'm sure that Joe Biden is appalled when he sees the bombing in Gaza. At the same time, he's always been a big recipient of Israeli-backed donations. So he's at a very difficult political spot. I wish I could give you a more optimistic outlook, but I'm really worried myself. Praying for the best.
What a trio! What a trio of optimistic characters. Yeah, well, I'm very grateful for the contribution, Clyde. Alberto, please.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Clyde. It's always a pleasure to see you both.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. I hope this was interesting. There was about 4,000 people listening live, so that's not bad, given that we use English. There were some people at the beginning asking for simultaneous translation, but we don't have that kind of money. We'll ask for a donation from Biden or Trump and see if we can set it up. Clyde, enjoy your afternoon out in the East Coast, and it's very hot here in St. Louis today.
Bye-bye. Ciao. Ciao, Clyde. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao. Thank you.